Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Beardy Penguin and welcome back to For All Kerbalkind, kicking off today's episode with the launch of Salyut 5. Now you might be wondering, Beardy, didn't you fail to launch this in the previous episode? And you would be correct, except we're doing what in reality the Soviets did with every failed launch, which is pretend it never existed. We're only doing it with this launch because, of course, Salyut 5 is actually one of our military Almaz stations, and so we're concealing the news of its first failed launch attempt. Now, we're launching this one and then another one later on in the episode. You can see rising above the cloud layer as we launch on a stormy October evening. Beautiful shot of the Yaka booster there. These volumetric clouds really do transform the game. The reason we need two more of these is because the photography experiment on board only has so much film, and it takes 2.5 years for it to fulfill that experiment, but we need to launch 4 of these stations to get all of the science we can get from it. We've already launched Salyut 2 and Salyut 3. Salyut 4 is a civilian space station, which we'll be sending a few missions to, but the military space stations are in sun-synchronous orbit so that they can complete that photography experiment, and it also coincidentally makes them harder for the Americans to reach and tamper with. And to really make sure they don't tamper with these stations, we've also started strapping on missiles. Yes, those missiles which were based on the R4 air-to-air missile, which the Soviet Air Force used in this time period, that we tested in a previous episode. More than just tested. We're now strapping those onto the sides of our military stations, just so the Americans don't get too curious. Heading on back to Baikonur, we unlock 1972 to 75 Hydrolox engines, and this is the node we've been waiting for because it gives us not only the RD-57 but the NK-15VM engine. This is effectively the Soviet J2 engine, and it has equivalent thrust and efficiency. We'll talk a little bit more about that later because that engine is more than a little bit controversial. For now, we're launching another UR-200 from Plesetsk with Svet 32 on board, and this is the third and final member of our geostationary communications network. We've had a couple of failed attempts to get satellites into geostationary orbit because of that final engine either overburning or shutting down prematurely, which is a little disconcerting considering it's the engine we use on our crewed lunar landers, but it's all more engine data to reduce the risk of that happening when a crew is actually making a descent down to the lunar surface. It makes me feel a lot better about the fact that we do have backup RD-859 engines on our crewed landers. But there we have it! All 3 Svet satellites in their intended orbits, and we are sharing the communications of those satellites with the European Space Agency, which will allow them to launch missions from Kourou across the Atlantic Ocean without losing contact. In the meantime, though, we're launching Soyuz 13, and this is a new crew for the aforementioned Salyut 4. We're doing a crew rotation, but Anastasia, the commander of the Soyuz, is not actually staying on the station. Alexei is going to stay as commander of the station. We're swapping over the other 2 Kerbals on board, Luna and Joanna, with Felix Kerman, who is from the Hungarian People's Republic and was named by Starch, and a brand new Intercosmos Kerbal called Zenon Kerman, and he is from the Polish People's Republic. He is the very first Polish Kerbal in space. I'm sure he'll be the pride of his country, and he's named by MCCDDK, one of my Emperor Penguins, and he's actually named after Zenon Jankowski, who was a real cosmonaut. He was the backup Polish cosmonaut that didn't fly back up to, I'm gonna butcher this, Miroslav Hermaszewski, who did actually fly on Soyuz 30 in reality. Performing this crew transfer actually causes us to complete the crew record of 5 crew contract, which gives us a tidy sum. Now, we're not actually doing one of the crew rotation contracts because we don't get offered them yet, as we still haven't completed the first space station contract. But to complete that, we actually only need to return 2 Kerbals that have been sent up to a space station, hence why we're doing this transfer, which is actually quite similar to operations on Soviet space stations in reality. Quite often, particularly Intercosmos, would go up and then actually go home after a day or so on the older Soyuz, because the Soyuz only has a limited on-orbit lifespan, so you want to send them home in the oldest one up there and make sure that you aren't having it go past its use-by date, so to speak. So Soyuz 12 now heading back with Anastasia on board, and Luna and Joanna are 2 Kerbals from the German Democratic Republic, named by Luna Nicole the Fox and Joseph 793. We've got quite a few Intercosmos Kerbals in the Cosmonaut Corps now, but with the station era arriving, we end up needing a lot of them, and very soon, of course, we're going to be returning crew back to the surface of the moon, potentially building a moon base. So we're going to need a lot of cosmonauts, pilots, scientists, and engineers, as they all serve a purpose. But we managed to land safely on the steppe of the homeland Soviet Union, and we recover the spacecraft after they've had their 4-month stay, and that finally completes the first space station contract. Of course, only just about recovering the money we lost from failing it the first time due to the massive decrease in our fund rewards, aka budget cuts, that we've been receiving. So now, as promised, we're launching Salyut 6, the last of our Almaz military space stations. Salyut 4, as we've proven we can rotate the crew, and later on in the episode we're going to be resupplying it as well, I think it's going to have a lot of longevity. I'm going to try and have it be effectively our Salyut 6 or perhaps even Salyut 7 equivalent. And I think Salyut 7, it would be nice to have that be our first lunar space station. It was, of course, a major space station in low Earth orbit in reality. I think it would be cool to diverge from reality and send it into orbit around the moon. But that's a long ways off yet. We need a heavy lift launch vehicle, the likes of the UR700, which we haven't designed or began building yet. We do have the engines though. We have the RD-270 and the RD-270M, which is powered by pentaborane fuel, because some absolute madman came up with that concept. So we can absolutely design it and start building it, but we don't really have the spare funds to tool it at the moment. Heading back on out into deep space, the crew of Rogatka have now been in deep space for exactly a year. They've got another 3 months to go, and, well, they've kind of lost their marbles. Both Millie and Konstantin are hovering at around 100% stress. The breaking of that treadmill really did cause some issues, but, well, at least they can celebrate the anniversary of their launch into space with a tidy 300,000 funds. I've seen it mentioned that one fund in Realism Overhaul is roughly equivalent to about $10,000 in today's money, which means we've actually got about $3 billion worth of reward there. Moving on over to French Guiana, we have the first launch of the Ariane 1, carrying the Mars Express and Beagle spacecraft on their way to the Red Planet, with the launch made possible by our newly completed geostationary comms network, allowing ground control to maintain contact with the launch vehicle across the Atlantic Ocean. Heading on back to Baikonur, though, we have a little bit more news from Rogatka. Konstantin has fumbled a valve and released some of the onboard nitrogen into space. Now, this is a random roll. This could have been any resource. So the fact that it was nitrogen, something that's non-mission essential, and an amount that means we're still going to have more than enough to get home, was a huge stroke of luck. My heart stopped when I saw that notification, but thankfully everything's okay and they're still on a course back to Earth. Now we see the culmination of years of research into Hydrolox Engines, the N2 Mush, which translates to might, and this monster is essentially our challenger to the Katten 5. The N2 can heft about 140 tons into low Earth orbit. Now I say about because I haven't actually tested it yet. Every mission I've designed for it, it's ended up being overbuilt, even grossly overbuilt for in this case. This is Krasnyy 3 and this is what we're launching in 1966's Mars window. We're a little bit late to the punch, but we have a lot of Delta V to spare here, as its upper two stages are Hydrolox powered using that newly unlocked NK-15 VM engine. You'll notice that the mission said multifaceted because Krasnyy 3 is actually 6 different spacecraft. We've got the main bus with most of the scientific instruments. We have MarsAcod, a rover, which is going to head down to the surface, which you'll see in the aeroshell. We then have 2 relay satellites and spacecraft, which are heading to Phobos and Deimos. You see that we did have 1 ignition failure, but it was on a central engine, and these NK-15 VM engines have got 5 ignitions, so it wasn't a problem, and otherwise the rocket performed absolutely perfectly. Now those 2 spacecraft, which you see strapped to the side, which are heading to Phobos and Deimos, they're actually sample return missions. It requires so little Delta V to land on them, as they're little more than asteroids, that we're going to be returning samples back to Earth in the next Earth to Mars transfer window, which is why you see parachutes and heat shields, as well as a little sample return canister at the top of them. This is all going to be sent on its way by our large fluorine transfer stage, which you've seen in previous episodes. Now this entire spacecraft bus weighs about 35 tons, so we had about 5 kilometers per second of Delta V left in that 3rd stage, but I wanted to launch something very safe on this first launch. I knew I didn't want to launch crew on it, we had to test it, and well, I didn't have any other launch vehicle capable of hefting 35 tons. It's a bit of an awkward amount to heft, and I thought, well, if the worst comes to the worst, we can afford to lose an entire stage of the N2 and still get this thing into orbit. So it just guaranteed that this very complex, very expensive mission got to orbit no matter what. We're now burning towards Mars, and as I said, we did miss the window slightly, so we're going to have to expend a little bit more Delta V and do a pretty hefty correction maneuver, but we have more than enough Delta V in that fluorine stage. And then the spacecraft, you see that actually has 2 of those RD-858 engines that we use on Svet satellite buses. That is just going to do the insertion into orbit around Mars, although we can save a lot of Delta V with a bit of aerobraking and of course letting go of the spacecraft which are heading off to Deimos and Phobos, and of course letting go of the rover which is heading into the atmosphere. And the main spacecraft and those 2 little satellites on the side are going to form a communications network, allowing us to stay in constant communication with the rover and sort of laying the groundwork for future Mars missions. I know N9 is also sending a communications network. I don't think we're going to beat the European Space Agency to Mars with their Beagle lander, so they'll probably, provided that mission is successful, be the first to landing something successfully on the surface of Mars. But we of course are sending the very first rover. I don't believe N9 has plans to match that particular achievement. As Krasnyy 3 heads out into deep space, we unlock advanced avionics and probes, which finally gives us access to the Progress spacecraft, allowing us to send automated resupply missions to our space stations, and not a moment too soon, as come New Year 1966, Salyut 4 is running very low on supplies. So instead of bringing the crew home and having to wait for the next Soyuz, we're going to send up a Progress and resupply in orbit, which is actually the first mission of its kind in the world, and we're trying to get our heads around sustainable future space station operations because, as I said, Salyut 4, I'm intending to be a long-term space station, not a single or just couple mission station like some of our previous ones have been. No, I want to keep resupplying it, keep crews up there, well, indefinitely. I'd like to keep it permanently occupied if possible and keep sending into Cosmos Kerbals and perhaps even some more Kerbals from the European Space Agency up to the station. Perhaps that's something we can do in 1967. I'm sure we've loaded a bunch of fruit and different sorts of treats on board for the crew as it is New Year. We've got a very exciting year ahead of us now that we have the mush in our fleet of launch vehicles. I mentioned that the NK-15 VM engine is controversial, and that's because it doesn't actually exist. It's a realistic extrapolation of what the Soviets could have developed if their plans for future Hydrolox evolutions of the N1 had come to fruition, but as it stands, they never got so far as developing schematics, let alone building those engines. But it has got realistic performance if they converted an NK-15V engine to run on Hydrolox, which is why I'm fine with using it in this alternate history setting. The RP1 devs absolutely despise it, but then again, that's because we're having fun, and well, to be honest, they absolutely hate most of the things that we do in this series because, God forbid, you play a mod pack any way other than the way that the developer intended. Regardless, the Progress 1 reaches Salyut 4, and we resupply the station not only with life support for the next 4 months, but also refueling the space station so that it doesn't have to depend on the Soyuz for attitude control. And now, after 15 months in deep space, Rogatka, the first crewed spacecraft to visit another planet, is finally returning home to Earth. After one final mental breakdown from one member of the crew, they enter Earth's sphere of influence and lay eyes on that pale blue dot for the first time in over a year. They head back up into the command module and gear up ready for the fiercest re-entry any Kerbal has ever endured. We do have to perform a small correction burn. This was actually to reduce the severity of that re-entry. If we re-enter so that we're traveling the same direction as the Earth rotation, we actually shave quite a lot of relative velocity off of our re-entry, which provides us with some crucial breathing room because it took a lot of simulations to get this re-entry corridor exactly right. We have a window of about 500 meters that we have to hit. Otherwise, they're either going to skip off into deep space again, or burn up, or die of G-force exposure. So no pressure or anything. After briefly passing out from the brutal deceleration, the two Kerbals look out the window and see the familiar fluffy clouds of their home. It was a tense re-entry. It was a skip re-entry, so we headed back up into space and re-entered a second time just to bleed off some of that heat that we were building up to make sure we didn't hit the peak heating of the capsule. But we did actually use all of the ablator on the capsule in that second re-entry. But thankfully we're traveling slow enough by that point that we were able to have a gentle touchdown in the Indian Ocean. But the crew are going to take a long time to recover. It's going to be almost 2 years before they're physically recovered from the mission. But I think it's fair to say that that will be the final foray into space for Millie and Konstantin. The Kerbals return as heroes, with jubilant crowds filling Red Square as both are awarded the nation's highest honor, Hero of the Soviet Union. Millie, the mastermind behind the trajectory that made the entire mission possible, makes a speech speaking of the trail they've blazed to the planets and of the many future missions she hopes will follow in their footsteps. But Konstantin is conspicuously silent. While Millie makes a triumphant return home to the Republic of Cuba, Konstantin is rarely seen in public again. Ground support staff at Baikonur report seeing him repeatedly venture out to the Rogatka launch pad for hours at a time, staring up at Venus twinkling in the evening sky, the place where some part of him was left behind.
A massive thank you to my patrons for their generous support, and an extra special thank you to The Amazing Steak, Dakota Clark, Madzor, Petulish Tinets, Simone67, Scott Milligan, Olaf Hammerhand, Lady Lagsalot, Jesse Smith, NX74656, Jordan Millward, Luna Nicole the Fox, Frosty Moon, Mr. Bluestar, and Poor Minister Pater.